This is, as we've said, the review of 2016, part 2. And we're not going to, recap on everything we talked about last week, otherwise we'd be here all day. But remember, those were some of the things that we looked at. We specifically were looking at Russia, weren't we? Spent quite a bit of time looking at Russia, quite a bit of time looking at the impact of Brexit on Europe, potentially down the line. And we started looking at Donald Trump. But just one little thing. In fact, have you got your Bibles with you? And I'm sort of conscious, perhaps last week we didn't really open them very much because all the slides are on the screen, all the words are on the screen. Have just a quick look at Daniel 11 verse 40, because this is the one small recap that I wanted to do just for a second, and you'll see why I want to in just a moment. So in Daniel 11, chapter 11 verse 40, I'll give you a second just to find that. But while you're finding it, you'll remember that these are the verses that are talking about the time of the end, and they're talking about the king of the south pushing at an individual person. Do you remember that? There it is. Look in Daniel 11 verse 40, in the authorised version, it says, "At the time of the end shall the king of the south," and who did we say the king of the south was? The US, us, it's the Tarshish powers based in Saudi Arabia, and that's why they're south. We'll look at that more in just a bit later on. So at the time of the end, these, America, Britain and so on, push at, that word means to goad, it means to wind up, really, it means to aggravate, at him. And we said the him was the king that was mentioned, this individual man that is mentioned from verse 36 to 39, and this man, we said, was none other than Gog from Ezekiel chapter 38. It's the description of Gog. And so what we've got at the time of the end is the America, Britain, and i.e. the king of the south, pushing at this individual. And what we said last time was, it's quite interesting in the dying days of Obama's administration that he appears to be sort of provoking Russia. Because what we said last Wednesday was, of course, that he had expelled 36 diplomats. Do you remember we said that? But I actually said something more. And here's what I said last week. I've grabbed the recording. I'm not playing the whole thing. But here's a little bit of what I said last week. And so what Obama is doing on the back of the US elections is causing as much trouble as he possibly can. And of course, only a few days ago, 36 diplomats were expelled, weren't they, from America. And I'm absolutely convinced between now and the date that Obama leaves office, he will do something more to Putin personally. I actually think he will. That's what I said last Wednesday. He's going to do something more. There's going to be something that happens to Putin between Obama and Putin before the end of his administration. 2 days later, i.e. Friday last week, this was the headline news.
This review on Russia's cyber attacks has now been made public, saying the campaign was ordered directly by President Vladimir Putin. The nation's intelligence chiefs have now briefed Donald Trump, the president-elect, on the election attacks. Let's go to our political reporter, Sarah Murray, who's outside Trump Tower in New York. What are you learning, Sarah?
Well, Wolf, even after meeting with the heads of the nation's top spy agencies, Donald Trump cannot bring himself to blame Russia for these election-related cyber attacks. But as for the intelligence community, they say they have high confidence. Not only did Russia try to interfere in the U.S. election, but that interference was ordered from the highest levels, from Russian President Vladimir Putin.
So lo and behold, 2 days later, and of course Obama is behind this, the Intelligence Committee don't just work on their own and call Trump to a meeting. Obama's hand is behind this. And so the Intelligence Committee pull Trump in and say Vladimir Putin is the man. It's not just Russia that's behind this, it came from him. And what I actually did was, I don't know if any of you have done this, but you can actually download and read the 25-page intelligence report on what America is saying about Vladimir Putin and Russia. And in this report, believe it or not, it's only 25 pages with quite a few spaces, it actually mentions Vladimir Putin by name 31 times. This whole report is just saying this is the man. Now, I've read quite a few books on Vladimir Putin, and sort of almost feel like I've got to know him to some extent by doing this, because these go through his whole history from birth to where we are now. And it's quite an interesting thing with this man. There's something that aggravates him more than anything else, and that is when people do not show him personally respect. That's why he became black belt with judo and so on, because he was a little guy, still is, and he was picked on. And so anybody that he doesn't care if you're enemies, he's quite happy to be your enemy. He doesn't really care if there's trust or not. He doesn't really care about that. He's quite happy to be America's enemy. But what he won't stand is where people are disrespectful of him and of Russia. He wants the world to respect Russia. He wants the world to respect him. He's got this ingrained thing. This is a major, major issue for Putin to be singled out and to be almost poked fun at as well during all of this. Donald Trump's reaction, well, I'll show you a little bit of his reaction that came out later on, earlier on this afternoon. But Trump accepts the US intelligence on Russia hacking, top aide says. You see, Trump is being backed into a serious corner on this now. So he's been presented by all these heavyweights saying, I know you want to be friends with Putin, but we're going to make it as difficult for you as we possibly can. We're going to throw every bit of mud at the wall before you get into power to make it increasingly difficult. And I know there's been even more allegations and bits and pieces that have been happening earlier on today with some false reports that have come out according to Trump. But this is what Trump said at his news conference around about 3 hours ago.
Now, I don't know that I'm going to get along with Vladimir Putin. I hope I do, but there's a good chance I won't. And if I don't, do you honestly believe that Hillary would be tougher on Putin than me? Does anybody in this room really believe that?
See, so you see where he's gone, where he's been forced to go. He started off by saying over the last few months he's going to be my best friend, we get on really well, to now saying, do you really, there's a good chance we might not get on, and do you really think that I'm not going to be tough on him? This is exactly where Obama was trying to push him. And now I'm not saying in Daniel 11 verse 40 that we have seen the total push here. What I'm saying, though, is I think this could well be part of it. When God says the king of the south is going to goad, is going to push at, is going to provoke this individual, I certainly think we've seen some of that underway on the news over the last few days. Is there going to be more? Could there be more? Most certainly there could well be. But I think we're certainly seeing some of it happen right now in front of our very eyes. So that was the sort of recap from last week, if you like. And what we're going to do, if you think about last week, what we said was there's Russia, there's Europe, there's Britain, there's America. And what we're going to do this evening is focus more and more in until we get into Israel, in fact, right into Jerusalem itself. And so what we're going to do is look at the nations that get closer in towards Israel. So the next nations in the circle, if you like, would be things like Turkey, things like countries like Iran, countries like Syria and Jordan. So we're just going to keep focusing through. And we're going to look at some of these headlines. You remember the Turkish coup and so on and so forth. We'll look at those. And as I promised you last week, we'll conclude all of this with something that I think is quite interesting that points to 2017 as potentially being a hugely significant year. But I'll leave that with you. I'll run that past you towards the end of this. Now, what I thought we'd do is before we start delving into all these other nations, I think, well, this is what I'm going to do. I think what I'm going to do is sort of try and show you how I see the sequence of events running from pretty much start to finish. Now, this is very, very high level. It's only a few slides to try and show you how I see the sequence working. Now, I'm pretty certain there'll be some of you in this audience that will say, well, I don't quite see the sequence like that. That's fine. There could be different ways of cutting this. However, what I would say is, I think what I'm going to show you holds water from a scriptural point of view. And the reason I say that is because what we're trying to do is mesh together many, many chapters, aren't we, from a prophecy point of view. It isn't just Ezekiel 38, is it? There's many, many different chapters. And they've all got to work, and they've all got to synchronise together and work together. And so what I'm going to show you is how I see it syncing, and I absolutely stand behind this as a possibility of the order of things happening. Your order, if you've got a different order, might well still fit, but here's how I think things are going to run through. And once I've shown you this, I think then it's easy to slot in the rest of the nations quite quickly. So here we go with a map of the world. I mean, clearly it isn't the world, but it's a good chunk of it. And the reason I'm showing you this chunk of the world is because predominantly this is the area of the world that God is interested in from a prophecy point of view. Because what God is interested in, of course, are the nations that are impacting Israel. And so, yes, there is big superpower nations like China and so on and so forth, but they're not really mentioned in the scriptures. What we're interested in is this part of the world. So there we go, looking here. But what we're going to do just to start with is to focus right in, and this is the start of the sequence. So I believe that the beginning of the sequence of events actually centred in on Israel, and I think there's going to be an initial conflagration between Israel and the immediate surrounding nations, or I should say possibly as well peoples. I'm talking here about Hezbollah in Lebanon. I'm talking about the Palestinians in Israel. I'm talking about Jordan. I'm talking about Syria. Because you see, there's too many passages in the Bible that talk about there being an issue between Israel and the immediate neighbours that surround it that needs to be brought into play in all of this in terms of the sequence of events. So I think the sort of chapters that we're looking at that talk about these things would be chapters like Zechariah 12. Zechariah 12 talks about the surrounding countries, the immediate surrounding countries that surround Israel. I think there's chapters like Psalm 83 that list out all of the immediate peoples that live around and about Israel that launch a war on Israel. I think there's chapters like Isaiah 17 that talk about the complete destruction of Syria that comes to an end as a nation, and the total and utter destruction of Damascus, which has not yet happened. Damascus is in a bit of a mess, but suburbs have been destroyed, but the whole city has not been destroyed. That still has to go. Jeremiah 49, and I could go on. There's many chapters that talk about this initial conflagration, and Jerusalem is their sort of major issue. It's a war against Israel's immediate neighbours concerning Jerusalem. But Zechariah 12 tells us in this particular war, Israel wins. Syria loses. In fact, it says that the pricking briars, right, that's what the Bible calls them, pricking briars, those are the nations and people that live round and about Israel that are constantly hurting them and poking them and whatever, they're going to be removed. So successful will Israel's war be against these immediate neighbours that Israel's pricking briars will be removed. And they'll breathe I think they'll be wounded to some extent, but actually they'll breathe a huge sigh of relief that all is now sorted. We have overcome. And Zechariah 12 says exactly that. However, after this war, I don't know all the events in between, and I could speculate, but we haven't got time to do that. But what is certain from Isaiah 17 is that there's a great void that's now left when Syria has completely and utterly been decimated and has failed as a nation entirely, because Damascus has gone. And so there's this great void that's appeared now right there just north of Israel. And I think into this void is where we see the events of Ezekiel 38 come in. So Magog, Meshach and Tubal talking about Russia. Russia heads up an invasion to come into this void and come through into Israel. And the nations that join it are Iran over there, Turkey up there, and Ethiopia and Libya over there in North Africa. And these nations, headed up by Russia, come zooming all the way down and end up, well actually, they end up in Egypt, but You know, we could go through lots of detail, but they come through Israel into Egypt, but end up fundamentally in Israel. Now, the motive of this war, somebody tell me, what's the motive of this war? What's Russia's motive? Spoil. It's nothing to do with religion, this. This isn't a religious war. This is a war about cash. It's about spoil. It's about oil. It's about gas. It's about control of this area. And down Russia comes into this area. Meanwhile, based down here in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and places like that, you try and say it, is who? Who are these nations down here? The flags probably give it away. Britain and America, Tarshish and the Young Lions, based down here. Now you can see why it's King of the North versus South, because here we are here, and here's this great force predominantly coming down from up here. You notice, by the way, I have not included any part of Europe in this war. And I'm going to prove to you, hopefully for the first time, that Europe has nothing whatsoever to do with this stage of the sequence of the war. The European war comes later, and it's not about money, it's not about spoil, it's about religion, and I'll show you about that and why that's the case in a minute. So here's Russia, but as we know from the scriptures, those guys, America and Britain, based down there, really get nowhere, do they? Do they defeat Russia? Do they push Russia out? No. The best they can do is say, "Why? What are you playing at?" So I've wiped them out. They're just not, they're of zero consequence to some extent. Now, there's Russia sat there in Israel. Somebody tell me what happens at this point. What's the big news that suddenly happens? Yes, and we could say, therefore, it's who arrives on the scene? Christ. We know that because in Zechariah 14, who comes into the great big conflict where Jerusalem has been ransacked and ruined, but the Lord Jesus Christ himself, who comes and descends onto where? Mount of Olives. But here's the amazing thing. He's not on his own. Because Zechariah 14 says he comes with the saints. Which means the judgment has happened by this point. It must be. He can't arrive with the saints if the saints haven't been judged, haven't been raised, haven't gone through whatever process, however long it might be. The judgment has already happened at this point. So Christ's initial return, if I can call it that, has already happened. Must have done. Do you agree? So here's Christ. He's now with the saints in Jerusalem, but it isn't the end of the story. Because here is when the Babel side of things kick off. Because what happens now is that here, following, I believe, the collapse of the EU as we sort of know it at the minute of 26 nations, remember I said last week there'll be a group of 10 that emerge with Germany as its centre. This is a resurrected Holy Roman Empire headed up with the Vatican, the woman, the harlot woman seated on 7 hills in Revelation 17. This now takes place. Now the reason I believe it takes place now and after the return of Christ into Jerusalem is simply because in Revelation 17 the beast and the woman make war against who? The Lamb. And those who are called and chosen and faithful. This, you see, has nothing to do with the previous war. This is a religious war after Christ is established in Jerusalem. And as crazy as that might seem, because we might say, well, surely no. I can't believe that somebody would fight against Christ when he's there in the land. Well, we might have said the same if we lived 2,000 years ago, when people might well have said to us, surely you don't think somebody would kill the Son of God? And they did. So this great beast and woman come down and literally make some sort of attack on Christ and the saints who are there in Jerusalem. And we're told that he overcomes this force. Now this force, of course, this is a Babel project that we said last week. Remember I said that this is a Babel project. This is about bringing nations back together that God had divided. And so this is a Babel project headed up by the false religion of Babylon, and that is completely destroyed. Now, the amazing thing is, Revelation talks about them being destroyed, and it says the beast and the woman end up in a lake of fire. Remember that? They're in now a lake of fire. And it turns out they never emerge again. They're gone forever. And Christ's kingdom now kicks off, and it now starts expanding, and eventually fills the entire world. But you know something? It's not quite the end of the story. And it's this final piece that, to me, makes everything make sense now. And come and have a look with me, if you would, at Revelation chapter 20. And this is something that we don't often think about, but it answers many, many questions, in my view, as to who the beast, who the false prophet is. It answers who Magog is, who some say is Germany, and so on and so forth. Now, if you have a look in Revelation chapter 20, here's something that happens at the end of the 1,000 millennial rule of Christ. Because we've got Christ now ruling, and he rules for 1,000 years. That's what this chapter says. And in verse 7, it says, when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is of the sand of the sea. Well, well, well. Gog and Magog suddenly back on the scene at the end of the millennial reign of Christ. What happens to Gog and Magog? They went up, in verse 9, on the breach of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. Now, here's the thing. Check it out, verse 10. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are. You see, the beast and the false prophet were destroyed when Christ first returned. That was the war when he first got back, the beast and the false prophet, the Vatican, and the resurrected Holy Roman Empire. And you know something? They've been there the whole time. They were utterly and totally destroyed. Some have said to me, Andy, I believe Magog is Germany. Germany is the Holy Roman Empire, the centre of it, and always has been, well, for at least 1,000 years. And actually, we're told here that the beast has stayed in this lake of fire, for the whole 1,000 years. Because this Gog and Magog, deceived by the devil, have ended up in the lake of fire with the beast and with the false prophet, the Vatican. And so what I'm saying to you is, Gog and Magog cannot be anything to do with Germany. It's impossible, because Germany has gone, it is the Holy Roman Empire beast in the lake of fire. And so Gog and Magog are what I'm saying it is, which is southern Russia. And therefore, at the end of time, at the end of the millennium, there's going to be a latter-day Vladimir Putin that comes on the scene. Another man from that northern territory. Another man who's predominantly interested in power and wealth, nothing really to do with religion. He just wants cash, he wants spoil. That's why it's a Gog and Magog chap at the very end. Therefore, I've explained all of that. For those who think that Europe must be involved and Magog is something to do with Germany, this categorically shows it cannot be the case. Germany and the Holy Roman Empire are forever finished as a Babel project and a Babylon religion at the return of Christ, never ever to appear again. But Gog and Magog make their final reappearance. And so there is Gog and Magog that reappear at the very end of the millennium, and they come down and attack Christ and the saints that we've just read, but Christ finally finishes it, and that is the end of the story. Or you might say, that's the beginning of the story, because this is when God himself comes back to earth, or not back to earth, but comes to earth and lives on earth with man. God is coming here at that point, because all sin and all death is now removed, and only immortal, sinless people remain on planet earth at that point. So there's my sequence. You might agree with it, you might not. But let's have a look now and slot in all the things that have been happening in that context. So first of all, let's have a look at Turkey. So I'm saying that Turkey is all to do with Togarmah and Gomer in Ezekiel chapter 38, and therefore it's a nation that's on side with Russia, as a partner with Russia when Russia invades. Russia, I don't think, takes over Turkey. It doesn't say that. It actually says Russia and Togarmah are working together, and Russia is acting as a guard to them and protecting them. Now, if you remember last year when we were here, there'd been a plane shot down by Turkey. Turkey had shot down a Russian plane. Do you remember that? And a number of Christadelphians emailed me through the World Watch saying, I thought you said Turkey would be on side with Russia, and yet it looks like there's going to be a war between Russia and Turkey. I said, hold fire. I don't think there will. Because fundamentally, God says that Turkey will be on side with Russia. And you know something? If you remain patient and not get carried away by a headline here and a headline there, look what happens. So after Erdogan apology, he's of course the leader of Turkey, Russia brings Turkey in from the cold. That was on the 2nd of July in 2016. So he apologises, and Russia now says, OK, let's sort of start making friends. Then, if you remember, there was a coup, wasn't there, in Turkey? Do you remember that? And it was quite close to Erdogan losing power. It was pretty close, because the army, many parts of the army had fought against him. Turkey's response to the coup could herald a permanent break with the West. And in fact, that is definitely happening now, because Turkey, for some time, had wanted to join Europe. That isn't part of the plan. You can see that Turkey isn't part of the beast system. Turkey is part of the Russian system, coming down with Gog and Magog. Now have a look at this. So this was on July the 29th, 2016. Turkey-Russia relations could benefit in the wake of the failed coup. So you can see why I'm now interested in this particular headline, and it continues. So this was now August the 10th. Putin mends broken relations with Turkey's Erdogan. So we're tracking all the way through here, Turkey gradually coming on side. And now I understand why there's a coup. Because the coup is the spark to bring Russia and Turkey back together and to distance Turkey away from the West and America. Because Turkey actually, Erdogan said, I think America is slightly behind this coup that's happened, and therefore I don't really want much more to do with America. I'm distancing myself. Putin says, I'll be your friend. Excuse me, I don't mind you shot down one of my planes. We can patch it up. And that's what that's saying. There they are, look, smiling, happy. Do you know something? As with most bullies, when Turkey hit Russia, instead of Russia reacting, most bullies actually don't like that. And Putin didn't respond aggressively, actually sort of backed away. Putin and Erdogan pledged deeper military contact after gas deal is signed. That was on October the 10th. Deeper military ties. What did the Bible say? Togarmah, Gomer. By the way, Togarmah is eastern Turkey and Gomer is western Turkey. Turkey's an enormous country, and both of those two territories are completely described by Togarmah and Gomer in Ezekiel 38. So there we go. Turkey has moved in exactly the right lines as we thought they were going to, and I think they will continue along that vein. What else have we got? Well, this was a headline. Do you remember this? Russia uses Iran as base for attacking IS in Syria. So what's been going on with Iran? Come and have a look at Ezekiel 38 just to see where this sort of fits in. So this is Ezekiel 38. So what we've got here is the description of Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal in verse 2. God saying, I'm going to turn you back, put hooks in your jaws and bring you forth and all your army in verse 4. And then he lists out some nations that come down with Russia or join Russia in this great big huge army that invade Israel. And the first on the list is who? Persia. And who's Persia? Iran. So first on the list is Iran. Second on the list is Ethiopia and Libya. There's Gomer, and next on the list is Togarmah. That's the Turkey bit there in verse 6, Gomer and Togarmah. But Persia is first on the list. You might therefore imagine that in the scale of it, Iran is the next big and closest element and partner of Russia. It's almost like God's listing these things out for us. So what's been going on with Iran, and do we see Russia and Iran working together? Well, yes, we do. So what we've got here is Iran firing missiles marked with Israel should be wiped, I think it said off the face of the earth. So we've basically got here Iran firing missiles, and then over there, this was all happening in March last year. So clearly, so there we go, that's that. Look at this one. Top Iranian general, Iran preparing for all-out war with America. This was in April last year, 2016. And of course, this is after the deal, isn't it? This is after the deal has gone through with America. And they're still talking about war. But here's an interesting one. Putin encourages Iran to join the Russia-led Eurasian alliance. So Putin is setting up this conglomeration of nations, and he wants Iran to join him. What does the Bible say? Iran is going to be with Russia. And if you look in verse 7, it says, be prepared, prepare for yourself, you and your company that are assembled unto you, and be a guard unto them. In other words, protect them, look after them, guard them. A bit like the Queen has guards that are guarding her. I think that's what we're talking about there. Syria conflict, Russian bombers use Iran base for airstrikes. That was also in August. And this caused quite a big story, didn't it, around the place, because for Russia to use its planes from Iran really needs a lot of military coordination for that to happen. And they don't really need to use Iran to launch attacks. So it was more about saying, look, we can use our partners like Iran to launch attacks if we so wish. Iran nuclear deal could collapse under Trump. Trump has said it's the worst deal, literally the worst deal he's ever seen in all of his life. I'm going to get rid of it. If he does do that, and goodness only knows what he will end up doing, I don't know, but he might do. And if he does do that, that in itself could create quite a lot of tension. Well, to say the least, it could create an enormous amount of tension if Trump keeps his word on that one. Iran, Russia reaffirm Middle Eastern access. That was December. That's only about 2 weeks ago. Here's the headline in the Washington Times that these two nations are reaffirming this Middle Eastern axis. That's exactly what the Bible says we should be looking for. You know, if I imagine God almost like with a chessboard and all the pieces are just being moved perfectly into place, there isn't much out of line, is there now? It really has lined up amazingly well. As well as Iran, I just want to divert off a little minute and talk about what the world calls the Gulf states. The Gulf states are those states that are around the edge of Saudi Arabia. The reason we're interested in those states and that area is because that is where Britain and America are allied to. So just as Russia is allied into Iran, Turkey, Northern Africa, it says, because in verse 13 of Ezekiel 38, it says Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish. So there's this group of nations based around the Saudi Arabian area that actually are there and allied to Britain and America, because Britain is Tarshish. So I find this quite interesting, because this is on November the 10th, again, just over a month ago. Today's opening of the Royal Navy's new Bahrain base seriously enhances Britain's ability to defend the Gulf. Where is Bahrain? Here is Bahrain. In fact, if you look on ancient maps where Sheba and Dedan were, which I've done, I haven't put it on this slide, should have done perhaps, but Sheba and Dedan, if you look at it, are exactly in this northern area of Saudi Arabia and encompassed exactly Bahrain, that we now know as Bahrain. It's exactly this area. It isn't the whole of Saudi Arabia, it's this bit around here. So it encompasses some of northern Saudi Arabia, but it definitely covers Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates and Oman. And there we are, look, Britain with a new base, military naval base, right here, smack in the middle of Sheba and Eden. The king of the south is getting its act together and building up forces. And by the way, I'm sure you're aware, Saudi Arabia is arch enemies of who? Who's Saudi Arabia's arch enemy? Iran. Fits, doesn't it? Because Iran's on the Russian side, Saudi Arabia, one Sunni and one Shia Muslim, by the way. These guys are Sunni and Iran is Shia. Britain plans to deepen security cooperation with the Gulf, and there is Theresa May surrounded by all these sheiky-looking people from the Gulf area. We are strengthening our ties. Boris Johnson keeps saying we're going to keep doing deals in this area. We're going to strengthen what we're doing there. We're going to build and continue to build our relationships, and in a military way as well as an economic way as well. So all that seems to be fitting in very, very well as well. What's been going on with Syria? Well, I'm just going to show you a couple of slides on this because the war continues to rumble on, and I don't think we need to keep putting up loads and loads of slides every time about this. But here's a few of the more recent slides so we sort of get it up to date as much as we can. The reason I'm interested in this headline here, Israeli airstrikes hit Damascus outskirts, and this was only at the back end of November, so about November the 30th, Israel struck Damascus, or the outskirts of it. In Isaiah 17, that talks about the complete and utter destruction of Damascus, it also talks about Israel being greatly weakened at the same time. It talks about Jacob's flesh waxing thin. So that leads me to conclude that at the same time that Syria comes to its total demise and Damascus completely ends as a city, Israel is weakened at that point. Which means to me that there's got to be potentially some involvement of Israel in the Syrian conflict. I might be wrong on this. I mean, I'm trying to work out how Israel could be weakened at the same time Damascus falls. But effectively, I think this is what does happen, that Israel sort of gets involved in this conflict. So when Israel is hitting Damascus, that says to me we could be getting more close to these events sparking off. Aleppo, of course, which is mentioned in Jeremiah 49 specifically as a city that's living in great fear and distress because it sees all the war and calamity going on. Jeremiah 49 speaks all about that. Aleppo risks becoming a giant graveyard. And the next verses, after the verses about Aleppo in Jeremiah 49, talk about Damascus itself coming to an end. It's exactly the parallel chapter to Isaiah 17. So again, the events of Aleppo, only at the back end of November, are hugely significant from a scriptural point of view. In fact, just have while we're there, let's have a quick look at it, so you know I'm not making it up. It's Jeremiah 49. And verse 23. So Jeremiah 49, verse 23, and it says concerning Damascus. This is my authorized version. And then it says Hamath is confounded and Arpad. Hamath is what we would now call modern-day Homs, and Arpad is the ancient name for modern-day Aleppo. And what's happening? It says, for they have heard evil tidings. They are faint-hearted. There is sorrow on the sea, or coming from the sea. It cannot be quiet. And then look what happens. Damascus is waxed feeble, turns to flee. Fear has seized on her. Anguish and sorrows have taken her as a woman in travail. Verse 26, all her young men shall fall in her streets, and all the men of war will be cut off in that day, says the Lord of hosts, and he will kindle a fire in the palace of the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, which is a title for the name of the king of Syria. So you see, Aleppo is mentioned there, and then sometime afterwards we see the complete destruction of Damascus. I think something's going to happen to bring that about. And lo and behold, December the 7th, 2.5, 3 weeks ago, Israel said to target Damascus airport in second Syria strike in a week. So something's building up. Why is Israel doing this? There are things that are happening in Damascus that it does not like, and therefore is beginning to strike on a more repeated basis. Putin, of course, is Mr. Smug over this because he's won Aleppo back for Assad. And there's been quite a few reports saying, well, after Crimea and Aleppo, what does Vladimir Putin want from his wars? What's his next plan? What's he going to do? Well, we know what he's going to do because God tells us ultimately what he's going to do. He's going to come down into Israel. Donald Trump has promised Syrian safe zones. Now, this could be, you can see how this could seriously start upsetting himself and Vladimir Putin, because as soon as you put a safe zone in Syria, you've got to put air power over it to protect it. And as soon as you do that, there's potential conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. And so, again, we wait to see what happens on that in terms of Syria. Syria ceasefire crumbles as Damascus on the brink of disaster. That was on the 4th of January, so we've snuck into 2017. I know it's a 2016 review, but I can't help myself. So here we are, only a few days ago, ceasefire crumbling, Damascus on the brink of disaster. All the pieces really coming together. And so, you know, let's have a look at this, because this is a massive story. So if you think about it, we've come in and in and in. We've dealt with Russia, Europe, Britain and America, Turkey, Iran, and so on, the northern African nations. We've looked at a little bit to do with Syria there. And here we are now in Israel. So we've come all the way straight into where it's all going to be centred. And this is quite incredible stuff, because the other thing that Obama's done, he really has made a right hash of it, to be fair, because in his dying days of office, not only is he trying to wind Russia up to such an extent that Trump has got no hope, he's also trying to do everything he possibly can to stop Trump having any major win with Israel by really forcing Israel down a track that Obama wants it to go down. And I'll explain this in just a second. I'm sure you've seen it on the news. But here we go. Obama, BAM is short for Obama. Obama betrays Israel. That's the big headline there. So we'll have a look at that in just a second. This has been building up over the last few months, because back in October the 14th, this was the headline: Israel freezes UNESCO ties for denying Jewish holy sites. Now, UNESCO is a United Nations body that effectively looks after holy sites and sites of, sort of national significance, and it sort of protects them and looks after them. And of course, one of these sites that it potentially says it has something to do with and sort of make sure everything's fine is the Temple Mount area. And on October the 14th, UNESCO, well, let me read this. It says, it comes after the body approved a text which repeatedly used only the Islamic name for a hilltop complex which is known as the holiest site in Judaism. The site is known to the Jews as Temple Mount. So UNESCO basically said Temple Mount and everything in it is Arab. It's nothing to do with Israel. They didn't quite say it as bluntly as that, but effectively that is exactly what they said. And Israel froze cooperation with the UN's cultural agency, accusing it of denying Judaism's connections with the religion's holiest sites. This is big, isn't it? This is now Jerusalem becoming a problem, and Israel really fighting back verbally, really, at this point. And here we go, look. So this now is in December, just a couple of weeks ago, Obama's parting betrayal of Israel. So that was UNESCO doing that bit on its own, and now Obama's stepping into the breach, and he says, right, I'm going to poke Israel in the eye before I go and make things very painful for you. And this is what it said in that article. President Barack Obama's ill-advised decision, and by the way, this is Bloomberg View. President Barack Obama's ill-advised decision to order the US to abstain on a United Nations resolution condemning Israeli settlements breaks with the past US policy, undermines a vital ally and sets back the cause of Middle East peace. Yet it also offers Democrats and Republicans a chance to unite around a more realistic approach to resolving one of the world's most intractable conflicts. The resolution passed last week says Israeli settlements built on land occupied since the 1967 war have no legal validity. It thus brands the 1/10 of Israel's Jews who live in East Jerusalem and the West Bank as residential outlaws and could thereby strengthen the efforts to sanction or boycott Israel or even sue it in international bodies. Now, this wasn't just a case of America abstaining. Netanyahu and the Israeli government have said it wasn't just about America abstaining from this vote. It was the fact that America, behind the scenes, organised the vote. That's what's wound up Netanyahu to this extent. Have a listen to him here.
Over decades, American administrations and Israeli governments have disagreed about settlements, but we agreed that the Security Council was not the place to resolve this issue. We knew that going there would make negotiations harder and drive peace further away. And as I told John Kerry on Thursday, friends don't take friends to the Security Council. I'm encouraged by the statements of our friends in the United States, Republicans and Democrats alike. They understand how reckless and destructive this UN resolution was. They understand that the Western Wall isn't occupied territory. I look forward to working with those friends and with the new administration when it takes office next month.
You can feel the anger there, can't you? He's not happy at all with what Obama's done, but the Security Council resolution is passed and will not be overturned. So Israel now is very much on the back foot. And in Obama's parting shot, he could well have sparked off not only things with Russia, but he could also have sparked things off with Israel. On top of all of that, Trump has suddenly started talking about Jerusalem, as he does with his tweets and his Twitters and goodness knows what else he does. But here, the Palestinians to Trump, it says, moving embassy to Jerusalem equals a declaration of war, because what Trump has said, well, let me show you what Trump has said.
We will move the American embassy to the eternal capital of the Jewish people, Jerusalem. And we will send a clear signal that there is no daylight between America and our most reliable ally, the State of Israel.
There you go. So he's been pretty emphatic about that. In fairness, other presidents-elect have said that they would move the embassy into Jerusalem, but probably not quite as powerfully as this man. He really has said this. And only a couple of days ago, and so on the 7th of January, where are we now? It's the 11th, I think, is it, of January today? But there we are on the 7th of January. Moving US embassy to Jerusalem is a red line. Jordan is warning. So you move the embassy, that's a red line. There's conflict. Jordan, by the way, is one of the nations that will get involved in the initial conflict with Israel when Syria gets involved. So there we are. Lots and lots happening, and Jerusalem is suddenly very much on the news, and I think will increasingly be so. In the last 5-10 minutes, I want to show you, though, why it is that potentially everything has lined up for this year. Do you want to see that quickly? Or have you had enough? No, we may as well do it to the end now, might we? Let's do it to the end. Okay. Let me show you why 2017 could be a spectacularly significant year on our calendar, on God's calendar. Remember this, the Lord Jesus Christ foretold events of AD 70 and the scattering of the Jews. He said that when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, you know the desolation thereof is nigh, and they're the days of vengeance. He then said that the people of Israel, the Jews, would fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. We know that. That happened in AD 70. He didn't stop there, though. If that was the end of his sentence, if that was a full stop and the end, instead of a colon and a continuation, what a desperate situation for the Jews. But Jesus didn't stop. It was a colon, and he said, after that, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So in other words, Jesus said, look, yes, Jews will lose control of Jerusalem until one day they get control of it back once again. And so with many other passages in Ezekiel and so on, we've known for a long, long time, well, before I was born and way back to when Christadelphians began with John Thomas, where in 1848 he said, actually, Israel will be re-established one day in the land of Palestine. He knew that in 1848, 100 years exactly before Israel was recreated. How did he know? Because of verses like this, and because of many other passages in the Bible as well that said that God would re-establish the nation of Israel. Now, the history of the nation of Israel is quite interesting, but to understand how it came to be, there are some significant dates on the calendar. And in this book here, it's a fantastic book that I was given when I stopped doing Sunday school at Pershaw. But this tracts, it's written by Martin Gilbert, and I don't know if any of you have got it, but it's absolutely brilliant because it talks about how modern Israel was created. And it's got all these facsimiles of original documents and the Balfour Declarations in here and letters from Herzl and all sorts of brilliant, brilliant things. But do you know where this book starts off? It starts off where it should start off, which is in 1897. And in 1897, the first Zionist Congress was convened by that man there called Theodor Herzl. And in Switzerland, he got together a whole bunch of Jews that were high profile in those days. And basically this conference was a Zionist conference. And the Zionist conference was about, that Zionism was about the recreation in Palestine of a Jewish homeland for the Jews. And so this is where it all began, in 1897. The next major date on the calendar was in 1917, when Lord Balfour, who was the foreign minister in the British government, wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild, who was then the head of the Zionist movement. And in that letter, and I've got a copy of it in that book there, but he basically writes and says, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. And so this is another major, major step. First step, Herzl saying, yes, we've got to do this. We're going to get a Congress together to talk about it. Next major step is this. Of course, this is massive because in 1914, basically through the First World War, Britain controlled that particular area of Israel because it kicked out the Ottoman Turks. The Turkish Empire was kicked out. So we were the controlling power of Israel, or Palestine as it was at that point. Hugely significant because the empire was at its peak at that point. The next major thing that happened, so Britain as the empire said, hey, we're going to help you get into the land. But it was 30 years later exactly, in the same month, almost to the day, in 1947, when the UN voted exactly the same as what Britain had said 30 years before. And that was to approve a partition of the land to allow the creation of the State of Israel. Yeah, that was 1947. And of course the following year was when Israel was born, in May 1948. In 1967 was the next major event, and this one is probably the peak of it all, really, because this one is when the Jews finally controlled Jerusalem. Up until this point, when the UN had partitioned the land, they said, Jerusalem is on the Arab side, and Israel is on this side. So Israel did not have control of the whole of Jerusalem. It had a little bit of it, but not all of it. But in the Six-Day War, where Israel fought with all its surrounding neighbours, Israel won and took over the whole of the land, and most significantly at that point, Jerusalem. Big event on God's calendar, don't you think? Definitely. The next big event that happened was this. there were a number of wars that rumbled along after 1967, but something changed in 1977. And in 1977, peace talks for the first time began between Israel and Egypt. They'd never had any peace talks with any of their neighbours before, and suddenly and Jimmy Carter was the American president at the time, and he pushed them. After 30 years of conflict, we're now going to get this off the ground, and we're going to start making peace. And so peace talks began. And really, since then, there haven't been any great big major events. The whole thing has rumbled on for 40 years. And really, the conflict hasn't gone away, and it hasn't exploded into anything major. It's just kept rumbling on, and people have kept talking about peace, but never quite getting there. But here's the thing. This is quite an amazing timeline. You see, in 1897 up to 1917 up to 2017, I should say, up to now, is 120 years. So the whole project of Israel began, and a 120-year period has gone by up until now. In 1917, for the first time ever, the occupying land and the occupying powers of the land said, we will give this land to the Jews. And 100 years have gone by, which brings us up to 2017. In 1947, the world, through the UN, voted to say, do you know what, we are going to give the land to Israel. Another massive, significant point. That 70 years have gone by. In 1967, they took over Jerusalem, and 50 years have gone by that bring us up to today. And peace talks between Israel and its surrounding neighbours began in 1977, that brings us 40 years later to now. Now, here's the thing. All of these dates, all of these years, are hugely significant from a biblical point of view. Every one of those dates is massive. Let me show you very quickly. All of these numbers in the Bible are to do with judgment or release of people or the end of a time of testing. Watch this. 120 years is only mentioned once in the Bible, and it's in relation to the flood. In Genesis chapter 6, God says, I will put up with this for 120 years. At the end of 120 years, the flood came. It was the countdown, it was God's clock counting down to the final judgment when God would flood the earth. 120 years is mentioned there. 100 years is mentioned in Genesis chapter 15, and it's the very, very first time that the word generation is mentioned in relation to a time period, and a generation is mentioned as being 100 years exactly. At the end of this period of time that Genesis 15 is talking about, it's the end of a period of time when the Jews were released out of Egypt, but judgment was about to come on the Amorites that lived in the land because their sin had reached the full. So this is about release and judgment. This is about judgment. 70 years. Now 70 years, you remember, is to do with the captivity of Israel being in captivity in the land of Babylon. And God said, after 70 years, I will release you. You will go back to the land. So Israel was in captivity, and then there was release. That was at the end of 70 years. 50 years is the big one. 50 years is the year of Jubilee. In the Bible, there's a final 50th year. Every 50 years is a Jubilee year. And in the 50th year, it's a year of release. It's a year when all debts were forgiven. It didn't matter what debts you had, they would be forgiven. And so 50 years, hugely significant period of time. 40 years in the Bible is significant of the time of testing. That's why the Jews spent 40 years in the wilderness. It's actually why Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness. 40 is symbolic of a time of testing. So what I'm suggesting to you is that 2017 lines up rather amazingly with all of these significant time periods in the Bible. Just by coincidence, would you say? Or could it be that 2017 is the time both of the beginning of the judgment, but perhaps, for some, release? Do you see that? Could be, couldn't it? especially when you add together all the things that we've talked about for 2 nights with Russia, with Britain, with Brexit, with Trump, with Jerusalem, with Syria, with Iran, with Turkey, with all of these things that have happened one after the other, and Jerusalem suddenly coming full pelt into the headlines with Trump statements and Obama doings. We really could be on the very brink of amazing things to happen in this year. I've gone on enormously, but hopefully it's shown you over these 2 evenings that God and his angels, the Lord Jesus Christ, are working flat out, I believe, right now. All the pieces are together. It probably needs one piece to start the checkmate sequence, but at some point that could happen, and it could happen at any day. But for those who are visitors in here thinking, well, do I wait and wait for, maybe Russia to come down or things to happen more so than even now, I would say don't. Because the judgment has taken place, as I said at the beginning, before Russia actually does come down and makes his move. If you're going to do something, there might not be too long left.